How's it going, everyone? I hope you're all doing good. Welcome to another study session. In this one we are going to be bringing all of what we've looked at throughout this series so far together and drawing the three major masses of the skeleton, being the skull, the ribcage and the pelvis. And of course these are all connected to the spine. I'm going to be drawing this on a 3/4 view. Now, if you are not aware, I do have individual videos covering all of these features of the skeleton in depth, as well as how to draw each one of them. And usually, when it comes to drawing something as complex as some of these features are, it involves drawing out a more manageable, simplified form to represent its realistic form. So for example, here I am starting with the spine, and in the video in which I discussed how to draw this, I had relied on a method from Proco. This involves firstly by deciding on the size of the spine and then marking out 4 equal units. So I divide this in half and then half these two halves. The lumbar section at the bottom is 1 1/4 units. The cervical section at the top is 3/4 of a unit, and that leaves the thoracic section in the middle, which will be 2 units. And so now that I have these proportional guidelines marked out, I'm able to draw in the spine with a consideration for everything that I covered more in depth in that video that I did on the spine's anatomy. And I think that's an important note to make in this video, because whilst I'm going to be to some extent summarising how to draw all of these features again, there is a lot more information provided in the more in-depth videos dedicated to one topic. And of course that information is something that I'm aware of as I draw these. I just want to make sure that we are all on the same page here, because the purpose of these study sessions are for me to learn with you. And if, for example, you've skipped the previous videos and come right to this one, then you might be in a less informed position, which in turn could make all of this more challenging. Anyways, here I have a 3/4 view of the simplified spine, and now I will begin to draw the skull. Also, by the way, you can approach these however you want, you don't have to start with the spine and so on. I'm doing that here mostly for the purpose of the video. So to draw the skull, I use a popular method by Andrew Loomis, and this has you starting out by drawing a ball. Now, I'm drawing this skull on top of the spine here because, well, that's where the skull goes, and at the top of the cervical section of the spine, there are 2 unique bones referred to as the atlas and the axis, and these connect to the occipital bone of the skull, and that section of the skull is rather flat, and so to compensate for that, instead of drawing the ball directly on top of the spine, like you might at first assume, I overlap the ball slightly, so that the cervical section of the spine is actually pushed into the skull. Now, the next step to construct the skull is to then divide up this ball with some cross contour lines, and how you position these determines the angle of the skull, and they are also used as the lines to help guide you when placing the skull's features. By the way, all of these methods do ensure that everything is in proportion. So here I wrap them around the ball, essentially creating 2 ellipses. Now the next step is to cut the sides and flatten the ball, and this is done by drawing some smaller ellipses, and the centre of these ellipses will be where your 2 contour lines cross at either side. Now I'm able to establish a central vertical line for the skull and divide this into 3 equal units. This bottom unit, which is below the ball, will be the bottom of the mandible of the skull, and I draw in its shape, connecting this to these side planes. So that's a simple means of constructing the skull, and you'll see how I develop this later and use these construction lines to position the skull's features correctly. So now I have the ribcage to add to this, and the ribcage is probably the easiest one to draw, as it's essentially an egg shape. I also know where to draw the rib cage, seeing as it will be placed at the thoracic section of the spine, hence why the official term for the rib cage is the thoracic cage. So the method that I used to draw the rib cage is from Gottfried Barnes. In his anatomy book, he demonstrates how the rib cage can be reduced down to a more simplified form, one which still includes the necessary planes and lines which define some anatomical features. Now, rather than starting by outlining the entire egg-like shape of the rib cage, I find it easier to start by drawing out the top plane of this simplified form. This represents the shape of the first set of ribs, and these of course meet the top of the manubrium, which is the top section of the sternum. Again, all of this will be familiar to you if you have watched the video on the anatomy of the rib cage. This top plane of the rib cage angles down to the top of the manubrium, and the back here tapers inwards at the centre, connecting to the spine, the same way the ribs of the rib cage do. And so by drawing out this top plane first, you establish the points in which you can then start drawing out the curved sections of the rib cage. Before I do that though, I try to define the end of the sternum, not the small xiphoid process section at the very end, but instead the body of the sternum. Because that's where the ribs curve up to and end. In fact, it's the cartilage that does that, but that's typically included when drawing the rib cage. But defining this point is helpful, and I tend to make this a little more than one head unit down from the bottom of the mandible. So around here is, I'd say, about a head unit down, and then I go down a bit more and mark a point. I've discussed using head units in the past, and I'll discuss that further in a moment, but that's a useful line to make. Now, one more point to make before I start drawing is where to end the rib cage. Remember, the ribs of the rib cage connect to the thoracic section of the spine, so I know that at the back, the rib cage ends at the bottom of that section of the spine, but the ribs actually curve downwards from that, ending a little further down. So considering this, I start to draw out a curved line at the back, down past the end of the thoracic section, and this curves back up to that point that I had marked out. I'll do the same at the other side, but of course I'm drawing this on a 3/4 view, and so we won't see much of this side. We will, however, see the inner side of this form as I curve a line back up to the bottom of the thoracic section. Now I can add a few more lines to define the planes of the rib cage and finish this simple form. So that's the rib cage drawn out, and now it's time to finally draw the pelvis. So the pelvis is something that I covered in the most recent study session. I've produced a video discussing the general anatomy, and then I made a video looking at how to draw it, and the best method I found was the bucket method by Proker, which I also think was inspired by Gottfried Barnes. So I had explained how to draw this simplified bucket step by step in those videos, so watch that if you haven't already, because here in this one I want to talk more about how it's drawn in context with the rest of what I've already drawn here. So the bottom of the spine sits on top of the sacrum, and the sacrum is about 1/3 the way down the back plane of the bucket. So what that means is, when I construct the bucket to draw the pelvis, I want to have the spine pushed into about 1/3 of the bucket, similar to what we did when drawing the skull on top of the spine. I layer this ellipse over the bottom, and I typically judge the size of this by observing the size of the rib cage. I have an understanding of the proportions when it comes to drawing each of these features, but then in addition to that, I also have to consider the proportions of everything together, which is when I start to consider Loomis's 8-head unit method. That's a proportional system that I've been using since the start of this series when I began studying anatomy. The human figure is divided into 8 equal units, and each of those units are the same size as the head, being the top of the ball to the bottom of the mandible that we had drawn when constructing the head. Here I have some lines extended out. This is 1 head unit. I'll put a page from Loomis's book on screen as well, in which he shows how the 8 head units apply to the skeleton of the figure, as well as the features on the surface of the body. The next unit down here should fall just above the bottom of the body of the sacrum, and this would be at the nipples of the body. The next one should be a little above the pelvis, this would be at the navel of the body. And finally the fourth one down should be around the bottom of the pelvis, and so these are the overall measurements that I'm considering as I draw all of this together. And then I also have methods of measuring proportions for the individual features, so I hope that makes sense. So what I'm going to do now is trace what I've just drawn here, and then I will lightly trace it again in this sketchbook next to this, so that I have the exact same construction that I've just drawn. Because for the purpose of this video, I want to show you how these forms can be developed to then draw the skeleton in detail, or I suppose it's more so a way for me to show you how well these simplified forms define their realistic forms. Depending on the purpose of your drawing, for the majority of the time I'd say that you won't be tasked with drawing the skeleton in such detail like this. Again, it's just an example that I wanted to show. Typically, you would construct the skeleton in a chosen position using these simplified forms and then build on top of that, adding the muscles. At least that's how I'm intending to progress. We still have a lot of the skeleton to study before moving on to the muscles, but that's something that we'll get to in time. Now, of course, I was observing a digital model of the skeleton to draw this in here. But you can see how most of the construction lines for these simplified forms are used as reference when working within them to draw a more realistic form. And again, I've covered how these are all drawn step by step in their own videos. So those are the three major masses of the skeleton: the skull, the rib cage and the pelvis, all of which are connected to the spine. In the next study session, we will be taking a look at the shoulder bones, adding to what we've drawn here in this video. So you will see me draw this many times throughout this series. With all that being said, I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, please give the video a like. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. If you enjoyed the content I create, then do consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You will gain access to exclusive tutorials, study documents, process papers, real-time drawing footage and more. Plus you will also be supporting me in a more personal way. Other than that, thank you for watching this video and I'll see you soon.